Our significant presence in Canada, documented since 1605, demonstrates that our contributions predate the country by well over 150 years. Indeed, up until 1961, over half of all Black people in Canada were born on this land. Our ancestors were also part of the fabric of Canada. Learn of that. Our sweat, skills, experiences, and contributions taken and used without consent and for free, built and shaped early Canada. Learn of that. For example, John Ware, Delmore Buddy Day, Dr. Yvette Bonney, they have undoubtedly pushed and carved Canada into the powerful promise that it is today. Learn of that. People of African descent are resilient, brave, spiritual, and master builders who have been central to the campaign for equality and an equitable Canada. Our new goal, African Canadian truth-telling, starting today. Learn of this.
As people of African descent, we offer this land recognition in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the efforts and deliberate intentions toward decolonization. We acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that was never meant to be owned. We recognize that most of the land that was entrusted to the Indigenous peoples was in some cases shared by choice, but all too often taken by force. We recognize the historical colonialism and the ongoing colonialism that has led to the present day situation where land acknowledgements are offered in place of land. As people of African descent, many of us have come here by choice, while many are here as a result of historical force. We acknowledge the complexities where we were promised land that was never given by those whose it never was to give. As people of African descent, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, express deep gratitude to its Indigenous peoples, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us. Written by Kay Johnson.
In this Western world where war is waged, we wear our wounds like warriors. Hearts on sleeves, we wear our wounds like tattoos written across our iris. We see the world in a peaceful violence, yet speak of the world in the ways in which we've been silenced. Like how they erect women like queens, then Mirandize a lady's liberties in the New York Minute. Strip you bare of your culture and ethnicity. Tell you you are free, yet criminalize you before you're proven guilty. They treat innocence like business, breaking bonds and stop people in cells like product and trade you when they lose interest. the price we pay in exchange for freedom. The American dream is a war between spirit and sin we've yet to wake up from. This dream is a nightmare for us melanated beings who walk in the light. We are immigrants who left our rights at the borders we crossed. We came from broken land to stolen land, this true north strong and free, this economic monopoly to commodify me. This land has clouded my vision, clouded my melanin, and made me feel blue. They blackmailed me with white lies, and I'm in search of truth. In search of change, no purple rain. They are yellow-bellied cowards green with envy. Rednecks who'd rather see me on gray concrete, soulless and empty, as my red blood runs towards a pot of gold, a fleeting rainbow that colors the canvas of a 2,000-year-old genocide. The paintbrush, a gun they use like exercise to run this country. Race is a fundraise marathon that's gotten the world off track. Race is a fundraise marathon that's gotten the world off track. Too many issues to get our reparations back for being black and excellent. They kill black bodies and extract our melanin for medicine. We are lab rats in a social experiment. They put fluoride in our water to make us docile. Chemicals in our food we cannot pronounce. That's the we need to keep out our mouth. They use our names as bonds of ownership. That's why they capitalize our names, so they can capitalize on our names. We are modern-day slaves in search of freedom. Growing up in the 6, when I was 7, I knew brothers that never ate, so they started carrying knives. Growing up in the 6, when I was 7, I knew brothers that never ate, so they started carrying knives. Like my best friend who started selling rocks and turning them to boulders. He started packing the heat because the waves were getting colder. Now, I don't condone selling poison to make a living, but we don't control the drugs that cross these borders into this new world order. Obama succeeded the snakes in the bush, only for America to pull the Trump card when we didn't look. Like a game of presidents, it's politics. That's why I'm hesitant to vote, just in case they ain't true. Duh. Obama succeeded the snakes in the bush, only for America to pull the Trump card when we didn't look. Like a game of president, it's politics. That's why I'm hesitant to vote, just in case they ain't true dough. I fear the world my children will inherit. So I do my best before they come, before I perish, to be the change I wish to see. So I wear my heart on my sleeves, tattooed across my skin are my wounds of this utopia I believe, in hopes of brighter tomorrows. Because every sunrise, a black mother's nature is mourning the death of her son at his wake. Mourning has become a ritual of survival, a coping mechanism, a means of honoring our reincarnated ancestors, because life and death coexist in the form of faith and breath, in the fleeting moment of an inhale. A reminder it is a gift to be alive. Despite the pain tattooed behind my eyes, here I stand. Tattooed across my skin are my wounds, the plight of this African Canadian man. Thank you. Give thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leo Campbell, and I am the chair of the board of directors for the Caribbean African Canadian Social Services. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome everyone on this call as we collectively observe the International Day for the Elimination for Racial Discrimination. Today marks another opportunity for all of us to stand steadfast with great resolve, with a commitment to end racism, racial discrimination, anti-Black racism, xenophobia, and intolerances to social, ethnic discrimination, religious, and as we've seen in these recent weeks, anti-Asian racism. As we all have watched and have been deeply alarmed by the current rise of anti-Asian racism this past week in the US, and our thoughts and our prayers are also with the Asian community as well. It is said that this is an imminent threat to our society, and it is very critical for all of us to come together, stand up, and defend the principles of equality and human dignity. You know, in May 2019, a poll was conducted by Ipsos for Global News. It revealed that nearly half of Canadians will admit to regularly having racist thoughts that they don't share with others. It is said, quote, "We found that almost 50% of Canadians believe it's okay and actually normal to have racist thoughts," said Sean Simpson, Vice President of Ipsos Public Affairs. In December 2019, yet another survey found that many Canadians across different racial backgrounds are still experiencing racism and discrimination from time to time, if not regularly. Over half of Black survey respondents, 54%, said that they have personally experienced discrimination due to race or their ethnicity in Canada. And even more troubling, most Canadians reported that they were aware of radicalized Canadians uh, experienced in discrimination either often or at least occasionally, with 73% of the survey respondents saying that they believe Black people still experience discrimination. Let us remember that no community is immune. And so, with that, today, as we observe the International Day for the Elimination for Racial Discrimination, I implore you today, March 21st, 2021, and every single day to stand up and to resist anti Black racism. This afternoon, we'll have a very frank conversation with Dr. Wendell Adige, a historian, humanitarian, and social entrepreneur. He is deeply committed to advancing pluralism, economic progress, and social change in North America and in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Adige, the board of directors of CAFCAN, and I thank you for consenting to be with us today. We thank you for your leadership, your invaluable expertise, and commitment to this work. We're also pleased to have our executive director, Floydine Charles Fidel, and her contributions to today's program. We appreciate her stewardship of CAFCAN. Just to let you know, CAFCAN is a B3 organization, Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-mandated. We are a registered charitable organization whose primary focus is on building and strengthening the services and the framework for African Canadian children, youth, families through culturally safe and individual and group counseling supports in all its forms. Once again, we are pleased to partner with the Children's Aid Society of Toronto as we work together in the fight to end racial discrimination, in particular, anti-Black racism at all levels of our institutions, agencies, and social at large. Finally, we owe a debt of gratitude today to those, our ancestors, our foreparents, our teachers, our leaders who have been engaged in this struggle and advocating for a better, fairer, equitable society. Let us continue to join hands together and work in solidarity. I leave you with the words of one of the 7 principles of our Kwanzaa, and that is to always do as much as we can in the way we can in order to leave our community more beautiful and beneficial than we inherited. So today, on behalf of CAFCAN, our board of directors, and our agency, we thank you for participating. We thank the organizers. We thank you, Sandra Whiting, for your vital role in organizing today's event, and we look forward to a wonderful conversation. Have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Rosebush, and I'm the CEO of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto. Not only am I very much looking forward to today's Courageous Conversation to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, I'm also thankful that Toronto Children's Aid is partnering with CAFCAN to support this important virtual presentation. As many of you know, we at Children's Aid have been asked and challenged to listen and change by the community. And so I am pleased to say we are. Championing diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of our 3 corporate priorities in our 3-year strategic plan. And we will continue to work hard to honor our new commitments that we have made in these areas. Currently, we are in the middle of a new round of consultations with numerous internal and external stakeholders to help us better understand how we can improve our service strategies and outcomes for Black and Black biracial children and families. We have also recently increased the size of our equity department as another sign of our commitment to combating anti-Black racism. And in the coming months, we will begin posting information about our updated anti-Black racism strategy to share with the community the new steps we will be taking on our journey to achieve our goals. By continuing to invest in our ABR work, and by allocating new resources to support this work, our hope is that we will create a more inclusive environment for all of our Black staff, and that we will, furthermore, make meaningful progress in relation to overcoming disparity and disproportionality in outcomes for the Black families, children, and youth that we serve. We have much work in front of us, and we are excited about moving forward together with community partners like CAFCAN, and we will not waver in our commitment to transform our agency. In closing, I would like to thank Floydine and the entire CAFCAN team for making today's discussion with Dr. Adjeti possible and for reaching out to include our team in today's important event. Thank you, everyone, and stay safe.
Always been second nature. A child prodigy of third world parents, so I have to tell my forefathers' stories on paper. Silence for too long, the strength of my tongue sentenced me to a life of right and wrongs. My penmanship bridges the gaps of intergenerational dialogues. Marginalized between the lines of lands my parents traveled. Sacrificing the familiarity of home to make ease for me life's inevitable battles. So who am I to not be what I was destined? Who are we to not be what we are destined? Despite school systems that labeled me and censured me to detention. Despite the target on my back and private funding to put my melanin in prison correction. I will not be your stereotype. I am made from the essence of stardust above aerial heights. It is not my fault you cannot see the light in me. You cannot enlighten me on your capitalist commodities. I'm the rose that still adapted to blossom out of colonized concrete. Capitalizing on conquered conquests my predecessors paved. Placing poetic politic on history's page. It is these pages cut from my family trees that once hung our forefathers as slaves. It is these pages I tell their stories. It is these lines they once hung from I celebrate their glory, just as they connected to my truth. See, these pages are sacred. It's how hip-hop's essence began as pure truth. But see, these days, I can't relate to what a lot of rappers are saying in the booth. Because see, this spoken word is a gift. And you can emanate life or death by the mere intention coming from your lips. We can speak dreams into existence, creating a world united or divided. So you can choose to be the change or remain silent. By size, the tongue is the strongest muscle in our bodies for a reason. By size, the tongue is the strongest muscle in our bodies for a reason. It is a tool to connect us to the divine. More than just speaking, it keeps us believing. A portal between time and space mixed, the inspiration of ancient hieroglyphs. See, our words can build dynasties and mend broken bonds. Our words can create vitality and give us a freedom of redemption songs. Our words can live beyond us like MLK's dream to see us free at last, so be mindful. Be mindful of the words and intentions that depart from the sacredness of your tongue. We are powerful vessels. The Creator etched presence into our lungs, so you have a gift within you. Leave a legacy that will continue. Etch your name in the dendrochronology of history's pages. Do not allow the from and to on your tombstone just to be dated. Let the dash in between reveal the story you told and of the magic that you created.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Floydine Charles Friedel from CAFCAN Social Services. I am humbled to sit in the seat as the operational lead at CAFCAN Social Services as the executive director. Today, I have the distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our esteemed guest. His name is Dr. Wendell Nilaria Ajiti, who is an award-winning historian, social entrepreneur, and humanitarian. Before joining the faculty at McGill University as Assistant Professor of U.S. and African Diaspora History in August 2019, Dr. Ajiti held the W.L. Mackenzie King Fellowship at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and Department of History Lectureship at Harvard University. His work has received numerous prizes, in addition to fellowships from the University of Pennsylvania, University of Toronto, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Princeton University, among others. Furthermore, he has served marginalized communities for over 15 years, remaining deeply committed to pluralism, economic progress, and social change in North America and Africa. Dr. Adjeti is the co-founder and president of the award-winning Tujenge Africa Foundation, a U.S. 501c3 that promotes inter-ethnic dialogue, ethical leadership, and university preparation and access in Burundi, East Africa. He is director or advisor on multiple boards that respectively advance global citizenship, pluralism, entrepreneurship and innovation, transformational economic development, and peace building. Dr. Adjeti earned the PhD, Master's in Philosophy, and Master's in Arts from Yale University. Please welcome warmly from wherever you are, Dr. Wendell Adjeti, to this courageous conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Floydine, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for that remarkable acknowledgement from Brother Wilson and Sister Walker, to Toronto Children's Aid Society as well, to the young brother Randall Ajay, who incidentally might be a cousin of mine. But that was just remarkable. So thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. So today we are going to embark on a courageous conversation. So we hope that our listening and viewing audience are ready. So I would like to begin, Dr. Adjeti, with a few questions because we just want to talk about a few things and invite you to be as candid and as forthright as you find necessary in this conversation today. So according to you, one cannot appreciate the various manifestations of anti-Black racism, including the ways that African peoples the world over internalize the violence of anti-Black racism without understanding its origins. We know that today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and on Thursday is the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. So the question for you at this point, sir, is can you contextualize the genesis of anti-Black racism and also the ways that Africans and their descendants throughout the African diaspora have resisted it?
Indeed, Floydine, one of the most cataclysmic, seismic, catastrophic events that has been inflicted upon our peoples as African peoples is a result of two historical processes. We know to some extent about the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, which is one of the two historical processes. But there's another historical process, which in fact preceded the transatlantic slave trade. And that was the trans-Saharan slave trade, which took African peoples, the indigenous peoples of Africa, took African peoples, ebony-skinned peoples, to the four winds, places as far and distant as the Ottoman Empire, to the Levant, what is present-day Syria, to Iraq, southern Iraq, and I'm going to circle back to that, to Arabia, Yemen, as far east as India, and sort of southern Asia. And so these historical processes of enslavement, of sort of racial terror that was inflicted upon African peoples by non-African peoples, in fact, inspired Europeans around the 1400s. This is what inspired the Portuguese to come sailing around the west coast of Africa. And they came in search of two things. They came in search of El Dorado because they had learned the tales of Mansa Musa, right, the Malian emperor, that Africa was a land of gold. And they also came looking for those whom they could subjugate, i.e. people whom they could enslave. And so as a result of this trans-Saharan, trans-Indian Ocean slave trade, Europeans learned something about the sheer wealth that was present on the African continent. And the reason why I sort of put an asterisk beside Iraq is because, and I want to be very careful for all of our little ones who might be listening, African peoples did not simply accept the fate of subjugation, that is racial tyranny, right? We didn't simply just accept it, but always fought back in various ways, in very complex and sort of genius ways. And one of the most significant forms of resistance that is often overlooked and seldom discussed, even among students of African history or African diaspora history, is a little known revolution that took place in southern Iraq. I kid you not, you can go to southern Iraq and you will see brothers and sisters who look exactly like you and I. And their ancestors have been there for over 800, 900 years, you see. But the revolution that took place in southern Iraq in a place called Basra, okay? It was called the Zanji Rebellion. Zanji in Arabic is black skin. So the enslaved peoples, their rebellion. This was easily the most profound and widespread and successful servile insurrection, to use sort of Jefferson's logic, the most successful slave rebellion in antiquity. It was so successful that it overthrew the Abbasid dynasty around 860 AD for many, many years, until eventually the revolutionaries could no longer protect the new borders that they had established. These were African peoples. The world does not tell us that well before Haiti, we had engaged in the most remarkable act of revolution the world had ever seen, right? These are the things we must recollect and share with our children, that we always resisted and fought back against tyranny. So there's this aspect of sort of knuckling up and fighting back. But we have also fought back in other ways as well. And one of the profound ways of fighting back, and this might seem sort of a little counterintuitive to some people, but fighting back as African peoples against racial tyranny entailed knowing our history. Literally, this is what our forebears predicated revolution on, that we must understand African history. We must understand from whence we came. We must understand that which our ancestors have endured. For she or he who knows the sacrifices that have enabled their position, their blessings in life, is more circumspect, is introspective, right? Is conscientious, okay? And the other aspect of knowing our history, the other revolutionary sort of profound ways that African peoples have resisted anti-Black racism and racial tyranny, is this idea of love of self, right? That we must love ourselves. We must teach our precious little babies to love themselves. And I'm going to circle back for the sake of, I know that we have Toronto CAS that has enthusiastically embraced this event. And I want to speak to that aspect of our children, our daughters, our sons who are in care, and those who are not in care, and the power of loving ourselves from sort of an Afrocentric, a Pan-African sort of idea of resisting racial tyranny and anti-Black racism.
Thank you. Now, you have said a lot, but I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how we were forced to, Blacks have been forced to internalize racism. And I know that the part of the continent that you're from, specifically Ghana, is on the Guinea, where you're from is from the Guinean coast. Am I correct?
100%.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about that in the context of today's conversation, please.
Yes, ma'am. Really quickly, in terms of how we've been made to internalize anti-Black racism, let me share something with you. There's this perverse lie that Europeans brought civilization, they brought religion, they brought humanity to Africa. It is categorically false. No conqueror, no invader brought something that had been indigenous to the African continent for thousands of years, right? And so profound is this idea that we regarded ourselves as a manifestation of the Creator. With our woolly hair, with our ebony skin, we knew that the Creator created us in the image of the Creator. There have been paintings discovered in the Nile Valley centuries ago, right? Paintings of Africans and their rendition of God, their rendition even of the Christ had ebony skin. The rendition even of the Virgin Mary, black skin, right? So this idea that we ought to hate ourselves and hate how we look, this is a new phenomenon that comes out of systems of racial oppression against African peoples, right? But in terms of your other question regarding our ancestors, not just mine, our ancestors, as because we are African peoples. Regarding the Gulf of Guinea, from whence I came, a place where my ancestors had settled when they left the River Nile over 800 years ago, and eventually arrived on the Accra Plains. The place from which I hail, during the transatlantic slave trade, my ancestors, or our ancestors, dubbed that place, a place in Teshi, they dubbed it Klemusum. In other words, they dubbed it the belly of the beast. Now, this is a really sort of profound appellation to describe what was happening around the time, because they knew nothing but war. They knew nothing but fire, right? Our foremothers would say they would bring bring forth sons who would immediately go to the front lines. Because if you couldn't fight, literally the entire continent was getting sold across the Atlantic. And so this place where my ancestors called, or our ancestors called, Klemusum, the belly of the beast, speaks to this idea that even during the greatest crime against humanity, which lasted over 400 years, they came to know an intimacy where death was concerned and where the afterlife was concerned. That anyone who had the gall and the temerity to lay siege on our women folk, on our children, on our men folk, would receive a one-way passage to the afterlife. Whether it was other Africans who were engaged in egregious forms of raiding just so they could buy tunics from the Europeans, whether it was the Portuguese, whether it was other European powers vying for our bodies, anybody, as my friends in the streets would say, anybody would get it. Before there was Tivoli Gardens or any hood in Jamaica or Trinidad or Guyana or Brazil, the British Empire, not just some local official, but the British Empire put a military base in my hood in a place called Teshi. Because we fight back. We don't tolerate subjugation based on our race. We don't tolerate any type of indignity. We fight back. And we live according to a code of justice. You see, that is who we are as African peoples.
Wow, you just hit on something when you talked about fighting back, because I have heard it said from some people like Dr. Akua Benjamin and Nene Kwesi Kafeli talk about resistance is in our DNA. And when you talk about the fighting back, and today we're talking about resisting anti-Black racism. But I want to also kind of somewhat shift to talk about, for you to share with us your thoughts on how mainstream organizations in particular during this time, because this past year we've experienced a lot of attention around anti-Black racism with the death of Regis Paczynski here in Toronto, and George Floyd, and many others whose names that have been called often. And mainstream organizations have been trying or expressing interest in anti-Black racism. But I often wonder when we hear, well, we send our staff on training or we do this, is that enough? Is the first part of the question. And the other part is, what is it that you think that they should be doing really to be intentional about addressing anti-Black racism in mainstream organizations? And then I have a part B pertaining to Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-mandated organizations.
Thank you. Very well. So we, in our tradition as African peoples, we appreciate anyone who is willing to work with us, support our cause for self-determination. Anyone who will act and work with us in good faith, we will respect that, we will honor that, and certainly in Canada as well. With respect to non-Black organizations that might want to engage in the work of self-determination, i.e., upholding and uplifting African peoples wherever we are, it's super important, first of all, to understand the fundamentals, right? To understand how anti-Black racism is literally hardwired into the DNA, into the very fabric, the sinews, the muscle, the blood of this nation called Canada, right? And as my brother mentioned in his opening remarks, we have been here since the early 1600s. Our labor was extracted without our consent. Black folk had endured bondage in colonial Canada, et cetera, et cetera. And so any organization that is willing to participate in the work of supporting and championing Black folk so that we could be whole and attain our rightful places as citizens on this land must understand the machinations of anti-Black racism, must understand sort of its structural implications. They must understand the implications of white supremacy and how it is also, again, part and parcel of the very fibers of our society. That is sort of a basic fundamental starting point, right? The upside, and there is an upside. The upside is that non-Black organizations that will work with Black people in good faith, many of these organizations have resources, okay? They have capacity. They are positioned in a way that some Black organizations simply are not, because our communities have been denied ways to accrue wealth and to retain wealth for the betterment of our own people, right? And so those organizations that are willing, that are forthright and are engaging in good faith advocacy and solidarity with Black communities, resource sharing, partnerships could occur, right? Not only resource sharing, but partnerships. And when you collaborate with Black organizations that understand the terrain, that are doing meaningful work, then we can even take the agenda a little further. Then we could talk about inaugurating or implementing some kind of paradigm shift, meaning now we're teaching the systems, we're teaching the institutions, we're shifting the gaze in terms of understanding where else we ought to go to make our society equitable, to make our society just and fair for everybody.
Thank you. So you talked about the upside. Can you talk a little bit about really the challenges? And you talked about and a bit about the system itself that has not been one that has supported, removing barriers to access to Black organizations, to Black communities in general. And I guess the foundation of that is grounded in anti-Black racism. So in this movement, because it feels a little bit like there's this movement happening, or like a snowball that's rolling and is gathering momentum, what is it that you would think that organizations need to look at, and the systems? And that includes, CAS, the Canadian Labour Congress, bureaucracies, governments, everybody, so that we can really start to see a meaningful and long-term change.
Indeed. Excellent question. And partly why I responded by saying that non-Black organizations that are willing to support the cause of Black people must ruminate on this idea of anti-Black racism from a structural level, meaning what are the implications where immigration is concerned? What are the implications where even foreign policy and Canadian aid to foreign countries and Canada's dealings with Africa and the diaspora are concerned? What are the implications where the judiciary is concerned and how Black people are criminalized in ways that others simply are not, right? What are the implications of the education system?
Yeah.
The fact that over 50% of our sons are not graduating in the GTA, this is egregious, right? What are the implications, structural implications that might be affecting our young women as well, right? What are the structural implications in terms of the labor market, in terms of public health and healthcare, in terms of housing? Right. And so understanding the implications from a systemic level immediately will position an organization that is operating in good faith to move closer to the mark. Right. But it's not simply sort of just understanding. There has to be a forthright effort, not simply to sort of tick off a box. Nowadays, sort of equity, diversity, inclusion has become in vogue. Right. There are some organizations that are steadfast and serious and sincere about making their organizations just and equitable and inclusive and diverse. Some organizations may merely pay lip service to it. Right. And so we need internal mechanisms in those non-Black organizations to identify sort of the empty rhetoric, the performance of Black solidarity, the performance of equity, the performance of resisting anti-Black racism, right? And so there has to be sort of an external facing orientation in terms of understanding structures, but then there has to be an internal, inward facing sort of self-examination to understand what are the organizational limitations. And this is why sometimes it's really effective for non-Black organizations to partner and collaborate with Black-led organizations that have a diasporic sort of orientation, that have a track record of doing this meaningful work, that have expertise, and that will enable sort of cross-pollination, right? And that's where growth, that's where structural change can occur, at least on that level.
Thank you. So what I'm interpreting from you're addressing policies and practices and all of those things. So it's not, if you will, lip service, but you can see action throughout. And I want to just throw in an additional question here is also to talk about the role of the board in not-for-profits and in organizations in ensuring that this work happens. Can you speak a little bit of that, the role of boards of directors and funders and so on?
Sure. So boards of directors are in place and serve multiple purposes, right? There's oversight, accountability, there's expertise, fundraising, et cetera, et cetera. And in order to ensure that especially non-Black organizations will remain accountable to their rhetoric of supporting Black communities and Black peoples, vulnerable Black peoples, it would make sense to incorporate members of our communities on these boards. And when I talk about sort of racial incorporation, bringing Black folk on board, right? I want to qualify that because we live in an age right now where something egregious happens to Black people, and then the world says, oh, we need X amount of Black people on a board. No, we don't. We don't just need any regular Black person on a board. We need Black people who are conscientious, Black people who have a racial consciousness, who understand the plight of our people, who have a class analysis, who will bring a gender analysis. This is what we need, conscientious Black folk. We don't need bougie Black folk to serve on any more boards. And no, that's not going to help our poor. It's not going to help my poor nieces and nephews who are living in Driftwood Courts and my godchildren in other parts of the country. That's not going to help them. But when we have Black folk who are conscientious, who have intimate connections to Black peoples and Black communities, right?
Mhm.
They can bring a wealth of knowledge and experience and expertise and insight that can help shift the agenda. And that's the qualification in terms of boards that are receptive to diversify and bringing Black folk along.
Thank you so much for that. Now, shifting a little bit again, um, as we speak about in relation to the elimination of racial discrimination as well as resisting anti-Black racism, can you please share your perspective about three things? The first of which is the importance of African Canadian institution building,
Mhm.
and the fortification of Black children and youth, and also the meaning and purpose of Black leadership. So if you need me to ask them again, that's fine. But those are the three areas
Okay.
that I would ask you to respond to, please.
Starting with African Canadian institution
The
building.
importance of it, yes.
The importance of it.
Yes.
Very well. I came across something going on 5 years now when I was working on my doctorate, and I was doing research in Canada and the United States. And I came across the words of one of the sort of community leaders in Toronto, in Canada, circa 1918, 1919. So after the end of the First Great War, after the end of World War I. And he said something which sent a cold chill down my spine. And what he said was, we must gather our people. We must gather our people. We must make a forthright effort to build our own institutions, because other races, i.e., other sort of ethno-cultural racial group, regardless of where they were coming from, other races are looking out for themselves and only themselves, and they will never help us until we get to a place where we can build our institutions. We could stand in solidarity and in community with one another from coast to coast, and with our kindred in the United States, and our kindred, of course, in the Caribbean and throughout the Americas and on the African continent. The reason why I thought this was so profound is because at every generation, those who preceded us understood that we must build our institutions. It's not racial separatism. It's not some kind of self-segregation, but the same way that other groups build their own institutions, they find ways to finance endeavors that benefit them and their posterity. The same ways that they are able to retain capital. This was the thinking coming out of World War I, when many of our sons had been sent to the Western Front to be sacrificed for a European cause. The Europeans themselves called it a white man's war, right? That even in the midst of this, there was this wherewithal that, hey, once the guns fall silent, Asian Canadians will do for their communities, right? Our Indigenous brothers and sisters will do for their communities. White folk will do for themselves. The Anglos, the Francophones, the newly arrived Europeans, everyone will do for their communities. We must come to a place to see beyond our linguistic differences, see beyond our ethnic, national differences. Who's dark, who's light? We must look beyond all of that. The only thing that must matter, and this is why that generation embraced Marcus Garvey, easily the greatest Jamaican ever, one of the greatest Africans ever born, right? Because Garvey brought this idea at the same time that these African Canadians were talking about building our institutions. So Garvey brought the idea of race first. Put everything else to the side because there's so many things to divide African peoples. Put race first. Let's build our institutions. Let's elevate our cause, right? Let's bring racial dignity back to our cause, okay? And so the importance of building African Canadian institutions from Vancouver all the way to North Preston in Nova Scotia, right? Where our brothers and sisters are catching a lot of hell, and they've been catching it for a few centuries. And we seldom even consider and think of them and talk about their plight as African Canadians, as our pioneering sort of elder statesmen and stateswomen on these lands, right? That we must build our institutions and to forge those connections, and to work regardless of what the differences are, because that's what always ensnares us, that we quibble over who's this, who's that, instead of understanding. And one of the reasons I appreciate CAFCAN's sort of mission and its vision is that it's diasporic and appreciating who we are as African peoples in Canada, right? And that was a mentality coming out of the war, out of the First World War. And so institution building cannot be stated, cannot be underscored more than that, just in terms of its importance, where we are and our future. Would you like me to speak to the other points that you
Sure.
mentioned?
Yes, please. Yes. So the second is with the fortification of Black children and youth.
Indeed. Okay. So this is something that is very close to my own heart. I've spent, without showing my age, I've spent over 16 years working with our children and youth and our young men. And sometimes when I say young men, I feel like I'm not telling the truth, because some of those young brothers, my brothers, are actually my age. A couple had been older than me, but I had spent years, and still do, supporting some of the most vulnerable among us. And one thing that we know it anecdotally, but we also know it through the scientific record, right? That anti-Black racism is a plague. It is a pestilence. It is a pestilence of an idea of sort of structures, and it pervades the Black psyche. And it pervades the Black psyche at a very young and tender age, you see. It is for this reason I won't buy any dolls for my nieces and nephews that don't look like them. I won't buy any books for them that won't show beautiful little Black boys and girls who look exactly like them, you see. And someone might think, well, isn't that a little extreme? That's because you don't know what we have to go through to love ourselves. The world hasn't a clue what we have to go through to love ourselves, to feel affirmed, to know that we are a creation of the divine, you see. And so where Black children and Black youth are concerned, the most important thing I could tell parents, I could tell grandparents and guardians and elders and even foster parents, okay? Anti-Black racism attacks Black children and destroys their self-image before kindergarten. The scientific record is very clear on this, okay? That's how young. And in fact, I would even go further, that it happens in utero, in gestation, you see, when our mothers are carrying us, because we're bombarded from every direction. But you have to be astute to discern where it's coming from, you see. You have to be very astute and on your toes and on guard all the time. And so one of the surest way, and our ancestors understood this, right? Before we endure the Middle Passage, when a child came into the world, an African child came into the world, based on the constellations, based on ancestral rights, you would be given up and held up to the Creator, right? To the Lord of hosts. Your ancestors would be invoked to give thanks that they have sent this blessing, and give thanks for the safe passage that said individual has arrived, and that may they do an honorable work and bring honor to the family, to the village, the proverbial village, right? In that process, they would do something. They were fortifying the spirit of that little one, right? And in fortifying the spirit of that little one, they would infuse this idea of sort of love of self, of history, of person. This is what Marcus Garvey would call race pride, right? That our children must be our children and our youth, they must be fortified with race pride. You must speak life into them. You must show them why they are worthy. Because if you don't, the world, before you know it, before they even go to school, will come home and tell you they want hair like little Timmy, they want blonde hair, or they want little Timmy's, the color of little Timmy's eyes, or little Sarah, the way that little Sarah's hair is straight. You see, our children are forever bombarded in the most sort of simple and innocuous ways. And so the surest way, the most effective firewall, and I'm going to use sort of an analogy with computers, firewalls where computers are concerned, keep out viruses, keep out external threats, right? A firewall for African peoples has to be race pride. It has to be knowledge of self, love of self, knowledge of history. This has to be a regimen. Every little Black girl and boy growing up in Canada should have a library of books and of characters and of stories that represent who they are, and a dedicated, whether it's mom or dad or uncle or auntie or grandparents or guardians, who will read and inculcate them with that spirit of race pride and love. This is the most profound lesson we could teach our children. And we must do it forthrightly, not say, oh, your ebony Black skin is beautiful. Meanwhile, the family's colorist, right? Not that, oh, your broad, beautiful African nose is beautiful. And then the family esteems alkaline sort of European nose. These little things, we think it's sort of innocuous and simple, but it's so profound in terms of making sure that Black children grow up strong, they grow up healthy, right? They grow up in a way that they can then contribute to the cause of liberation of Black people wherever we are, in our racial dignity and our material sort of well-being as well.
Fantastic. So we're close to the end before we get to the audience questions. But the last part of this is the meaning and purpose of Black leadership. If you could answer that. And then I have a question that's going to be, I think, a little bit interesting to hear your response.
Okay.
Or, I mean, your responses have been fantastic. I want to take this opportunity also to thank you for your wisdom and your insight. It has been truly remarkable having this experience and hearing from you today. So the last part is the meaning and purpose of Black leadership.
Black leadership.
Yes.
I've been thinking of Black leadership for a while, because one thing that we know from the historical record is that when Black folk stand strong and chant down Babylon and the forces of white supremacy, as our great historian, Pan-African historian John Henrik Clarke said, they are disappeared, they are imprisoned, or they die mysteriously, right? And as CLR James said, you don't play with revolution. And it's not revolution with arms, but revolution is a concept of the mind, you see. And so when we think of Black leadership, it is no small objective. But I've been thinking a lot about Black leadership because we live in an age today where self-aggrandizement, egos, narcissism, the desire to be acknowledged, sort of social media fame, has created a legion of fake prophets and false leaders who purport to do good for Black folk, but they do nothing but instead increase the burden on our shoulders, our collective shoulders, right? To be a Black leader, one must have a track record of sacrificing for African peoples. First and foremost, you must have a track record of sacrificing for our peoples. Your fancy degree will not make you and cannot make you a leader, right? Living in a fancy neighborhood cannot make you a leader. Having friends in high places does not necessarily make you a leader. A leader has to have, a quote unquote Black leader has to have a clear track record of sacrificing for Black folk, serving the most marginalized among us, you see. Moreover, a leader must come from our ranks. Only Black people, in the spirit of self-determination, only we get to choose. Only we get to anoint and appoint our leaders, not the dominant white society, not white organizations, not white leftists or other political organizations or orientations. Nobody gets to choose our leaders except Black folk. And we will choose individuals from our ranks who have the credibility, whom we've vetted and know to be sincere. Because what we also know is that even the Canadian government conspired with the US government to send quote unquote leaders in our midst who did nothing but try to destroy our genuine pursuit of human rights and self-determination in Canada. And this is why it's so important. So not every Tom and Harry on Instagram or whatever, or YouTube or wherever, quote unquote, these new leaders are emerging, or Twitter, can declare themselves a leader. The community has to do that. And to be a leader requires sacrifice. And in that way, people should know that no, you shouldn't just simply put up your hand. I'm a leader. It is a serious thing. And from whence our ancestors came on the Guinea coast, whomever was leading the war party, when things were rough and invasions were sort of ubiquitous, right? And the siege of the transatlantic slave trade, those who had to lead, people would run away from it because they knew the cost of leadership. So if you're not about that life to stand forthrightly and sincerely for African peoples, do not play yourself off as a leader to white people and white leftists or the white media. And that's something the white media often does. It will anoint and appoint our leaders. It is exceptionally anti-Black, and we need to have the courage to call it out.
Wow, pretty profound. So, a provocative question. You know, when we talk about resisting anti-Black racism or anti-Black racism, we often, as African people, think about the other, as in it's not us. I'm wondering if you could comment, please, on how anti-Black racism plays itself out within African Canadian communities. And I know it's a provocative question, but I think it's this is a courageous conversation. So it's important for us to do some introspection and some navel gazing so that we can move past the challenges that we face. So if you could speak a bit about the idea of anti-Black racism and how it manifests within African Canadian communities and groups and organizations and so forth, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for the individual who submitted it. Internalized anti-Black racism is our greatest foe. It is actually worse than white supremacy itself. Internalized anti-Black racism is our greatest foe. It is worse than white supremacy itself. Right. I want to share a very quick sort of historical example, that around the 1500s, historians have sort of concluded that around the 1500s, so the transatlantic slave trade had started. There was a time, and it continued to happen, Europeans would go to war over religion, over turf, over all sorts of things. And they would massacre one another. They would annihilate one another. But one thing they decided they wouldn't ever do ever again is that no European, i.e. no white man or white person, can be subjected to servitude, to bondage, to become chattel, property, right, of another white person. Although they could be indentured servants, which is qualitatively a little different, right? But Europeans had this consensus. As African peoples on sort of the West Coast, from Senegambia all the way to Angola, we didn't fully get the memo. We didn't fully get the memo. And many of us on the continent, in the Caribbean, in South America, and North America, still haven't gotten the memo. That the world order was predicated, the modern world order was predicated on race. that there were some things that Europeans would never do. They swore they wouldn't do to one another ever again. We didn't really get that memo. And so this notion of internalizing anti-Black racism, and the reason why it is worse than white supremacy, is because when we see other Black folk, we don't immediately think of somebody who is working as a proxy for our adversaries, right? When we are seated at the table and trying to figure out how to address pressing issues in our communities, there might be individuals who have internalized anti-Black racism who might pretend like they're with the cause, but they're working overtime to undermine the cause. And they're undermining the cause in so many different ways. And one common way is that sometimes people can be petty as flip. People can be petty as flip, that they cannot see the bigger objective, that egos get in the way. And before they know it, they're undermining a cause. They're undermining Black people. They're undermining our pursuit of self-determination because their ego has gotten in the way, because they already hate themselves. They can't even stand the image of themselves, of their ebony skin, because they're dealing with past traumas that they haven't confronted. And as a result, they've become sort of unwitting proxies of white supremacy, you see. And so this internalized form of anti-Black racism, and the reason why we must address these issues urgently and forthrightly, is because it's like the Trojan horse. All of our pursuits of liberation often are betrayed from within, are compromised from within. When we're on the right side of the law, and we usually are on the right side of the law, even then, there are those who are conspiring with the media, conspiring with the state, conspiring with the state, then with Babylon, conspiring with forces that don't necessarily want the best for our posterity. So every Black person, I don't care how enlightened you think you are, we must do that internal sort of, that introspective, circumspective work of understanding where we stand, who we are. That when we're placed in a position, is our first inclination to destroy another Black person? Or can we be adults and have a conversation with someone and say, hey, you really offended me, or you did this that I didn't like. I felt like you undermined me, as opposed to going to the media, going to the state, or doing other things that just compromises and makes our progress that much harder. Right.
Thank you so much. We're getting ready to move into the part of the program where we have a few minutes left for questions and answers from those who are listening and watching. Before that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your wisdom and for your insight, as I said earlier. Would also like to thank Paul Rosebush and Leo Campbell and Kwame Williams and Marie Clark Walker, Sandra Whiting, Valerie Augustine, the entire team that worked on this to have this conversation with you today. I'm sure it is the beginning of many. And right now, I'm just going to turn it over to the audience to post their questions so that you will have an opportunity to respond. I think we have about 10 to 15 minutes of those. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I'll keep my response short.
This was good and necessary. So let's see. All right. Well, we don't yet have any questions, so maybe you answered them all already. Well, people are still absorbing the depth of your responses because it's been quite a lot that you've had us share. And somebody,
Ms. Floydie,
yes,
I noticed a gentleman by the name of Kingsley Gilliam asked.
Gilliam?
Yes, he asked if I could elaborate on a concept I spoke about at my expert testimony at the Justice Donald McLeod hearing.
I think that's a different conversation.
Okay.
I think that would be for a different piece.
And this is why I should allow you to continue to be the chairwoman. Yeah, I'll
yes,
step.
yes, yes, because we would I think that's a different forum.
Mhm.
Let's see. There are some responses. What do you think about adoption of a Black child outside of our community?
Wow, your viewers are not holding back. Truth be told, I don't know if I'm the most qualified person to answer it, but if I may answer it in this way, every Black child that comes forth from the womb must undergo a concerted sort of regimen where they're taught to love who they are, and that the adults around them have to practice what they preach, so that that little Black girl or little Black boy will grow up to have a healthy self-perception, you see. So that if it happens that an African child falls in the hands of genuine, kind, decent people who are not African, if they are willing to show that child and to teach them a race pride and love of self and love of their history, that would be more profound than what a lot of other people are not doing right now, you see.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay. Can you speak more to tools that we can use to speak to the internalized racism of our brothers and sisters?
First and foremost, we need to have courageous conversations. We need to call out internalized anti-Black racism. Internalized anti-Black racism is why our greatest leaders would often be compromised or betrayed, why our pursuit of self-determination is often undermined, right? It is internalized anti-Black racism. And so we must be able to name it. We don't need to shame it, but we must name it and we must rebuke it, and rebuke it in love to ensure that African peoples can be corrected and still sort of embraced by the broader village, right? Unless they're individuals who are sort of recusants, i.e., they're unwilling to change their ways, then we can't have people in our communities who are constantly undermining us. They should be sort of excommunicated, right? So being frank about it, understanding what it is, understanding what it looks like,
right?
Engaging with text, understanding our history, understanding where we have gone wrong, how we were undermined in other instances, right? This is when history makes sense and literally brings life to our various just causes.
Good. Question here. Thank you for that. And another question is, how do we deal with those who sell us out?
That's an excellent question. It is an excellent question. And we have always had sellouts. Even on the African coast, we had sellouts where the Sahara slave trade was concerned. We had sellouts during the Middle Passage. We had sellouts on the plantation. We still have sellouts in our communities. And said individuals, I believe that redemption, any human being is capable of redemption. If somebody is unwilling to go through that process of community accountability, i.e. redemption, Black folks should understand who they are and where they stand, and that said individuals should be sort of excommunicated, right? They should be moved away from the community, because that process creates a great deal of trauma. And that's something I haven't really spoken to. The process of betraying Black people and telling our most intimate sort of family affairs to a white media, a white-run media, or other white organizations, the level of trauma that creates for the rest of us and not to mention our little precious ones who are always watching and paying attention, you see? And so individuals who are quote unquote sellouts, who are, as I write in my work in the historical record, we call them agent provocateurs. They should be exposed for who they are, right? Because we can't deal with any more trauma. We have more trauma than the world can even comprehend for another 1,000 years. We don't need any more trauma for the love of our ancestors.
CAFCAN, Caribbean African Canadian Social Services Agency, is a Me3 organization. Black-led, Black-serving and Black-mandated. Building community together. Our primary focus is on building and strengthening the service framework by providing programs and services for Caribbean African Canadian children, youth and families, through culturally safe individual and group counseling supports, case management services, employment services, youth mentorship, and youth outreach programs. We want to thank all those who have generously contributed and those who will now begin to do so. To donate, please click the link.
So I think, can you able to hear me?
Yes, I can.
I think we ran into a little technical challenge. And okay, so there's another question on how do I educate white folks on why just because they're Black, they don't represent the plight of Black folks. That was in quotation. So the question is, how do you educate whites about, just in quotes, just because they are Black, they don't represent the plight of Black folks, unquote, end quote.
Oh, that is actually such an excellent question. Oh my goodness. Thank you to the individual who had the wherewithal to ask that question. And to be very candid, Black folk have been complacent on multiple fronts in this country. We have been exceptionally complacent. There was a time when our community, yes, as African Canadians, we had so much moral authority when we couldn't, our sons and daughters couldn't even get to go to universities. They were denied the opportunity to go to universities, you see. And the moral authority that we had were our foremothers who were working as in quote unquote domestic worker capacities, or our forefathers who were working as sleeping car porters on the train, you see. Yet we had a moral authority that when we spoke, prime ministers would listen. When we went to Parliament Hill to address the various forms of white supremacy that were outwardly facing or inwardly facing in Canada, white folk would listen. But in the last 30 years, something really egregious has happened. And it's a level of complacency. We have forgotten, and of course, we've also taken our eyes off the prize. Right. And so this idea that it is incumbent upon us to let the white media know, to let white institutions know, to let other white power brokers know that they don't get to anoint and appoint our leaders, that it is an egregious form of anti-Black racism whenever they do it, and that we must chant it down. You see, and historically, that's how agent provocateurs have been snuck into our ranks, and then they undermine us, and then they undermine the cause, and then who gets to deal with the trauma? Our little babies, because we pass it on to them, and then we screw up their lives, right?
You may have to sorry, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am.
No, you may have to respond to this.
Sure.
How would you recommend approaching institutional racism within any institution or organization that you are working in?
Okay, thank you for reminding me to speed up my responses. The one thing I would say regarding that question is that we don't need Black faces in high spaces. We need Black people who have a racial consciousness, whether in Black-led organizations or non-Black organizations that want to buttress the work of Black organizations. We need individuals with a racial consciousness, meaning they have dealt with whatever anti-Black racism they might have internalized or white supremacy they might have internalized, and that when they work and advocate and champion, they do it for the betterment of our most vulnerable ones, our precious daughters, our sons, and members of our community.
Thank you. I believe that's it for the questions. Again, thank you very much. And we will now move to concluding our program. So again, thank you, a heartfelt thank you from me personally and from our organization.
Most
and
welcome.
On behalf of, I know Paul as well
Yes.
expresses his heartfelt thanks. So
Thank
thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you.
I was born by the river in a little tent, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long, long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, and I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long, long time coming, but I know change gon' come. Oh, yes, it will. I go to the movie and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling me, don't hang around. It's been a long, long time coming, but I know change gon' come. Oh, yes, it will. And then I go to my brother, and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Oh, there's been times when I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change